an honor to have here the leading researchers, scholars in psychotherapy research, just coming from the Society of Psychotherapy Research conference that was in Amsterdam with 800-something people, and now we are very privileged to have them here in a much more intimate way that we can engage and discuss these issues. I'm happy to introduce Louis Castonguay, who is a professor in the Department of Psychology at Penn State University. He is a past president of the Society of Psychotherapy Research. He is the recipient of the Distinguished Lifetime Contribution to the Scientific Study of Psychotherapy and recipient of the Leadership Award of the Society of Exploration of Psychotherapy Integration. He is the recipient of the Distinguished Research Publication Award of Division 29. He is the recipient of the Distinguished Contribution Teaching and Mentoring for Division 29. Can go on and on. So, and I can go on and on, but I think you may want to hear Louis too, and not like only that. So please, Louis.
These very kind words. You could just have summarized it by he's a friend of Jacques. This is how my vitae starts. I know Jacques Barber. So thank you, Sigal. Thank you, Oria, also to bring us together. I mean, there's no words, right? I could say honor and privilege, but I think you kind of could guess my feeling. I just want to thank Jonathan. Because this morning, I got up and I looked at my window and I saw the temple and I was like, boy, this is humbling, really. Is there another Louis Castonguay you were thinking about when they invited me? And then it just got a little bit worse because I went to have breakfast and I saw all the people that will be presenting. It's like, really? And then you had to talk about Freud and Einstein. It's like, center of imposter, maximizing it. Okay, so, there's many controversies, there's of course many debate in psychotherapy at all sorts of levels, but in my view, the most sad and unfortunate schism is between the clinicians and researchers. We belong in different community of knowledge seeker, we all seek knowledge. But we have very few contact and very few, let alone integration. And I think it's, as we say in French, it's a indifférence maladroite, a clumsy indifference, considering the complexity of psychopathology and the complexity of the process of change. So it's really, really kind of unfortunate that we believe that one way of accumulating knowledge can actually be sufficient to allow us to understand and on to deal with these problems. There are, of course, different pathway of addressing this divide. One that many people who will be presenting have taken, certainly I have taken it for a long time, which is an issue of a model of importation and exportations of knowledge. Right? That's one way of addressing this divide. It certainly has value about it, right? It gave me tenure, so that's good that we have this traditional form of research. But the problem, of course, associated with this is it tends to be a one-way street. As Kasdan put it very eloquently, one of the problems with the current way that we are thinking implicitly, if not explicitly, about what is the knowledge that we use to guide our practice and our policy is one that is actually dictating by the researchers. And in some ways what it does doing this is that we let the knowledge and the wisdom of clinicians to drop through the whole of the colander. The colander is like, I don't know if that's the correct way of saying it in English. You know when you cook pasta and you put the pasta in that thing where all the water comes down? Colander. So that's basically one of the things that is taking place now. It's like we're not really paying attention to the wisdom, the knowledge of the clinicians of course, there's a lot of book and we read about them, but how to influence the design, the selections of ideas. So there's another way, of course, which actually is to work together, having clinicians and researchers to work in combinations. So it's a different type of research. It's a research that's called practice-oriented research. And this is what I'm going to be talking about today. I'm going to give a few examples of how come we have not done that before. It took us a very long time to do this in a more systematic way. A few examples, and then a few ideas about how to, for those who might be interested in continuing this kind of a new paradigm, might be good heuristic values for that. Okay. First methodological problem, which is that thing is now still working, or maybe Job? Put it on, John. Okay. So essentially the idea, again, you know, I don't want to do an all or none. That is, we have to abandon the traditional way of doing research. The traditional way, but let's be honest, the traditional way of doing research is that faculty member are interested, guided by their research interest. And in order to maximize the internal validity, we try to control as much as possible the environment where we're conducting studies. That's great values, but it's also limited. If we restrict ourselves in terms of our the empirical foundations of our thinking and practice, if we limit ourselves to only this type of research. So practice-oriented research is one where clinicians and researchers are establishing partnerships, that they're working together with two goals. The first goal is to provide what I call an antidote to empirical imperialism. So what is empirical imperialism? Essentially what it is when you have people like me, who sees 2 or 3 clients a week, has the audacity of saying to people who see 30 clients a week, this is what you should be studying, or this is what you should be paying attention to, right? Again, there is some value, but if the only way that we're going to invent science is by listening to our own voice, well, we're going to perpetuate this schism, right? And the key, I think, is to actually create some new landscape of practice and knowledge. The issue, of course, and we have to go way beyond the metaphor of the bridge between science and practice. Because this metaphor is based on, we're standing on 2 different sides of a river. And we're hoping that by actually cutting that our idea goes over the bridge, that we're going to actually advance. And we can be so sophisticated when we talk about translation research. It has its place, but that's not the only way. Another way is actually creating an island where both researchers and clinicians are working together. They are thinking about what should we be studying, what would be interested in both of them, and surprise, surprise, there's a lot of convergence, and how we're going to do that in a way that will not impose drastic change to the practice, and in a way that will actually confound practice and research, right? This is kind of a way of going close to what I call clinically syntonic research. We know what ego-syntonic is. Clinically syntonic research is to come up with some research where when the individual is collecting data, he or she is actually would not be able to answer the questions, is the information you're collecting for research purpose or for clinical purposes? They have to say, I don't know, because it's both at the same time. We don't have to wait for 15 years before we actually have the result of the research that we're collaborating in. All right. So there are, of course, a number of obstacles to this partnership. It seems obvious to me that there should have been more discussions between contact, not integrations between researchers and clinicians. But there's a lot of obstacles about it. Many of them, I'm not going to talk about all of them, but there certainly is traumatic experiences. You know, many people who goes through their dissertation defense gets out of that and feels humiliated, right? And because there's always 1 or 2 faculty members who will pay a lot of attention to the methodology, right? So there's, you know, we idolize methodology and a complete ignorance of substance. And this is not something that happened in the 60s, even in my department at Penn State, where it's supposed to be very clinical friendly. There's a lot of the focus on, you know, the perfect methodology. And even at the time when it's actually time to kind of help the person to feel absolutely great about what he or she is doing and how the research is really clinically helpful, still shaming the person for not having control of all the variables. So when we have these traumatic experiences, we're surprised that people actually later on, when they have a job that they might be doing research, they might do it, but they won't certainly do it with many faculty members because they've been traumatized by it. There's also a lack of perceived relevance by some clinicians, by actually a lot of clinicians, right? In terms of how does the research may actually be implemented, right? So, you know, I was actually looking at what we were doing, and I think that finally in our work, we are getting there. But I realized this is session 16, and in the protocol, we got one more to go, right? So we're gonna have to stop to work together. I mean, we're just getting there. Right? You know, actually, last session, I really felt that we were doing something really good, but my supervisor reminded me that there's two things that I did that I should have not done. So if it's at all possible that you ignore the thing that seems to work, that would be so fantastic. And then we're surprised that there's some limitation. And of course, you know, there are times, right? Because there's only 29 hours in a day, right? That there's no more. I'm still looking for number 30. And so if we actually want to build partnership where people are actually doing both research and practice, it's not going to be possible unless we combine the two. And a big reason is also a lack of models. When I was at Stony Brook to do my PhD in a very cognitive behavior therapy model, it was the temple of cognitive behavior therapy at the time, I did research on emotion, the therapeutic alliance, and the past in cognitive behavior therapy. I don't think that I've ever met a humanistic-oriented therapist or a psychodynamic therapist who would have been bored if I'd say that my colleagues and I in our study shows that the extent to which cognitive behavior therapists talked about the attachment relationship between clients in their early years with their parents, the extent to which the therapists actually facilitate emotional deepening and create a therapeutic alliance was positively linked with outcome. I think most psychodynamic therapists would say, oh, this is kind of interesting. I don't think I would find a cognitive behavior therapist who would say, this is really boring, that in my dissertations I find that the therapist's adherence to what was in the manual of cognitive behavior therapy was negatively linked with outcome. But when we contextualize and we control for relationship variable, that negative relationship disappeared. Therefore, it is not that the cognitive therapy techniques are irrelevant or detrimental. It's the context and how you apply it, right? That, I think, would be interesting to all the clinicians. And part of the reason why I did that research, a big part, is because my advisor was Mark Goldfried. I say was, he's still my advisor. I'm still his research assistant, it looks like, every time he's asking me for something. But he was a cognitive behavior therapist, but he was also has always seen clients. So I think that's a major problem, is the onus is on people like me or faculty member who see very few clients, because we're not open to a kind of what are the ideas that are partially interesting for the clinician. So either we do click or we work with them. Fortunately, there has been, over the years, partnerships that have been developed between researchers and clinicians. And we summarized this literature in 2013 in the Handbook of Psychotherapy and Behavior Change. There are 3 lines of research, and I'll provide a few examples. Patient-focused research, practice-based research, and practice research network. And I'll mostly focus on practice research network to give you an idea of the type of research that is being done as a complementary to what we may refer as evidence-based practice. So what are some of the convergence between these 3 different, because they are of course really overlapping. In some ways it implies that the studies are conducted in the naturalistic setting. So they're not conducting in a controlled environment. They are within the naturalistic setting. but they also base, the studies are based on the adoption of standardized measure system as part of the clinical routine. So you want, ideally actually, and this is something that, that is being done in some of the practice research network that I've been privileged to be involved in, the clinicians are deciding to use the standardized instruments as part of the clinical routine. And then kind of being conscious that this may actually serve for also empirical functions. So you don't add. This is because of this concept that there's only 29 hours in the day. So you actually have to confound the research and the practice. That the information that you're going to look for clinical practice may also serve for empirical research. And there's some unified goals, right? Providing clinicians with an opportunity to be an active participant with different level of commitment and different type of tasks in the research, but certainly not one where you just sit the clinician, please fill out this measure. And please don't tell me that this measure is not covering everything. Because of course you don't understand the issue of reliability and validity. I do, so don't tell me that my instruments can actually be improved. I don't want to hear this. And then we're surprised, oh, they're so resistant. Right? So having the practitioner, having a voice there, using data as it's being collected to inform their interventions. Again, the issue of clinically symptomic. We want to solve this issue of split between research. One way is actually confounding both of them, right? So that the information is immediately available, actionable. That's not the only way to do research, but that certainly is a good strategy to avoid that schism, to bypass it, so that we're working together at the right moment. Examining questions that are perceived as relevant in their practice, right? And I would actually say it's one more than relevance. We need to raise the bar. Relevant is not enough. Every piece of research can say this is relevant, right? Now, every article you publish in GCCV or psychotherapy research, they're going to ask you, how is that clinically relevant? I can make a story for anything that is clinically relevant. That's not important enough. It needs to be clinically helpful, right? Be clinically like, oh, this I can use, right? This I can actually retain, right? And I think the faculty member who only see 2 or 3 clients per week, we don't have the knowledge to know what's retainable in clinical practice. I don't think we do. We may have a guess, but I don't think that we do. And allow the practitioner to contribute to the accumulations of rigorous knowledge, allowing the publications of research that is being co-created, either created by clinicians or co-creating in between clinicians and researchers. So these are some of the convergence. So why should we do it? Why should we do practice-oriented research? I mean, the first one is that it compensates the limitation of evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice, I refer to this term as the traditional form of research, conducted by researchers in controlled setting. So there's a lot of emphasis in internal validity, which is absolutely great, it's fantastic. But with internal validity, well, there's some limitations in terms of external validity, right? So it compensates to linking up both. I think this, in some ways, that's the most important one. It's because it increases our confidence in our knowledge. If we conduct a study into a controlled setting, and we have very similar effect size by conducting the same studies in a different type of environment and clinical routine, we can be a little bit more confident, hey, I think there's something there, because it's walked through the noise that is inherent in the 2 different kind of general setting. So that's why I have a lot of confidence in the finding about the alliance, because it was actually finding RCTs, but it was also found generally with the same effect size in an environment where there was less control. So it's increased our confidence about it. It broadened our understanding and practice because we're asking questions from different sources. It provided a voice to the clinicians in setting up research agenda, right? We gotta stop limiting ourselves to the granting agency. Really? Have you seen what actually happened? Behavior therapists for years and years and years saying the medical model is the worst thing that's ever happened, right? Behavior therapy was actually created out of a repulsions or revolutions against the medical model, right? There is no difference between psychopathology, abnormal learning, and normal learning. Read Ben-Jura, that's what it's all about. Read the early texts that were influenced by Skinner. And then suddenly the NIMH says, we're only going to be funding studies that actually have a specific diagnosis. Well, let's forget about Ben-Jura and Skinner. Let's all study depression and anxiety disorders, right? So in some ways what we need to do, and then in the last 5 years, who cares about diagnosis? It's all about our doc. Who was ever interested in specific diagnosis, right? So we get, of course, there is some value into this, but we actually need to also be looking at wonder how many clinicians are interested in RDoc, how many clinicians know what RDoc is. And then we're going to be surprised, oh, they don't read our research, fascinating. Right? So we need to kind of know what they are actually thinking about. And it reflects and contributes to the integrations movement. Most of the clinicians define themselves as integrative, but very few studies are conducted from an integrative perspective, right? But if you actually ask clinicians what should be studying together, most of the studies will be relevant for different form of therapy, and therefore it will be integrative. Okay, so a few examples. I'm going to go very fast about patient-focused research. Everybody kind of know about this. So some of the main goal of this type of research is to examine the pattern of change, right? For individual or specific group of individual, providing tools to support clinical decision, not to regiment it, but to support it, right? And there's some wonderful example about, for example, research that has been done on feedback of the major leadership work of Michael Lamberg that actually shows, well, whether or not we want to admit it, you know, all of us have clients, about 5 to 8% of our clients who actually deteriorate. And also there's some research that shows that we're really, really bad at predicting who will actually deteriorate. So we actually we underestimate the number of people who deteriorate in our practice, but we're also really bad to actually predict who is the person who will get worse during and or as a result of psychotherapy. So providing feedback to clinicians can be very, very, very useful to actually highlight, right? Kind of saying, well, this with that person, you may want to be careful, or you may want to pay more attention. And there's also wonderful now studies that shows that by providing feedback, it also can help people to do a better job, especially to actually reducing deteriorations, right? So, and part of the feedback is providing feedback about the quality of the working alliance. So this is where the alliances actually is there, so you may pay attention. And one of the things that is wonderful about this is that people from different theoretical orientation, from clinical perspective and conceptual perspective, have been talking about the importance of a therapeutic relationship for a long time. Behavior therapy in the 50s, we're talking about the importance of, if people were reading, if cognitive behavior therapists especially, were reading the original work of behavior therapists, they realized how much emphasis was put on the therapeutic value of the therapeutic relationship. But so did Freud, right? In 1913, he was writing this fantastic paper, and it says, so when should we give interpretations? In 1913, he wrote, we should give interpretation only when we have established a good therapeutic rapport. And this is especially the case, he wrote, when the interpretation is accurate. And then he said, usually the therapeutic effect of an accurate interpretation given before an alliance is actually being established, at the moment is nothing. The result of oral analysis, however, is, I don't know how to say that in English, but it's pretty bad. So we have a convergence between theory and clinic, right? I think Einstein and Freud could have agreed on this one. So a few examples now of practice evidence-based research. Now this is less looking at partnership research that have been less looking at how clients are changing, but what are some of the variables that may actually foster or interfere with the change as it is conducted in naturalistic setting. So some of the earliest research, not necessarily the early, but some of the earliest research on the therapist effect were conducted in a naturalistic setting. And now we know, right, that the therapist effects explaining between 5 and 8% of variance. The beauty of looking at a therapist effect in a practice-oriented type of research, it's because contrary to what it is done in RCTs, and I've been guilty of that. In an RCT, a therapist effect is noise. You want to control this because you really want to answer what is the treatment that is better than the other. So the fact that there's some therapists that are better than others is annoying. It's like, oh, really? This is actually really annoying. She's really good. She's going to screw up our studies. Well, in practice-oriented research, it's, yes, he's better, right? It's a very kind of different perspective. So out of these research also, I've come, now we're moving toward understanding also that there are some variables that could actually explain why some therapists are better than the other, and in which circumstances, right? So what we know by doing research in naturalistic settings, kind of humbling, is for about 75% of our clients, it doesn't matter who they see. Isn't that humbling? All of this time that we've been spending, being supervised and supervising others, 75% doesn't really matter. However, for the most impaired, or people who have the highest distress, the difference in studies and clinical routine between whether that person will see somebody who is more effective than the majority of therapists, as opposed to seeing somebody who is less effective than the majority, is huge. So if you really like somebody who has a lot of problem, be careful and ask for, make sure that this person will be seeing an effective therapist. The problem, of course, unless you use measure of outcome, and even then, but it's like it's a tool, is I don't think that we really know what's the criteria, right? I mean, we think that we know who are the best therapists. I'm not sure, though, about that. All right, there's also some research that have been done in terms of, what is the effectiveness, for example, how things are working, not only for the therapist, but to the single services, places where the studies are being conducted. Again, it's not limited to RCT in terms of which treatment are working, but what are services. And there's been wonderful research that has been done in the UK that shows that specific services or centers are as effective, irrespective of their theoretical orientations. And the beauty of these type of research is that it's an investigated form of research that has not received a lot of attention, like person-centered therapy, in our current externally funded form of research. Because our current form of research that have been funded are the one that the academicians are pretending to apply, not necessarily what the clinicians are applying in their practice. And then there's also some research that have been looking at multiple services, even at a national level, right? So wonderful studies that have been conducted by Bill Stile and Michael Barkham that look at the national level of the UK system. The Dodo verdict still is relevant. But it has not been restricted only to the UK. There's wonderful research that has been done in Latin America with Egley in Buenos Aires about looking at the effectiveness of a specific services. There's some that have been done in the US, for example. Really kind of interesting research that was done in Texas where there was a group of clinicians who were treating the Center for Juvenile with Substance Abuse. So young late adolescents, early adult with a substance abuse and comorbid, and it's a residential center. And they were interested, yes I know clinicians are interested in data, it's really hard to believe. They were interested to see if their treatment was actually working. And they've noticed that the substance abuse is decreasing, but they also noticed by looking at the data that the highest score when the clients came in was not substance abuse, it was hostility. And their highest score at the end of the treatment was hostility. So they didn't touch that. Right? So what did they do? They actually kind of like went around and figured out, okay, so which is the treatment that has some empirical data about treating hostility in adolescents. And they called Ellis. And Ellis said, sure, I'll train you. And they did a very interesting research design, pre-post training, and they showed, guess what? When you actually train clinicians to use a method that has been targeting hostility, you can actually show the result, that it's actually decreasing. And then they presented that at SPR. They heard about other people talking about this thing called the Working Alliance. They thought, oh, this is really interesting. And then they called me up and they said, you know, I'm interested in the Working Alliance. Would you be interested in doing that? And I said, well, and we could also do something bigger. And then one of my graduate students was saying, I'm really interested in attachment. And so we did this really interesting study. So combinations of researchers, clinicians, and researchers, a faculty member, and graduate students, and clinicians. And basically one of the things that we showed was that the relationship between the alliance and the outcome was moderated by the quality of the attachment. That people who had low score in the attachment pre-treatment, the relationship between the alliance and outcome was higher. Right? So probably, you know, and it's inferential, of course, but an issue is the therapeutic relationship is actually providing a corrective experience. So what does this say is that in this type of research, there's no drastic change required to CBT. They were using Ellis treatment model. It's not like we have to stop using this form of treatment, right? Which is crucial. This is a complete different perspective from the importation and exportation model. At the beginning of the UK attempt to bring science and clinical practice, it's basically said to people, stop what you're doing for the last 35 years. Now you got to use CBT. It didn't work. I wonder why. So, and then the techniques are good, but they're no suffisance to maximize the evidence-based practice and the importance of being also attuned to individualized needs of the client. Right? So this is how evidence-based practice and the effectiveness of CBT, dynamic cognitive behavior therapists, can actually be improved by having collaborations with clinicians. But I'll focus a little bit more on practice research networks. So essentially, what it is, it's either a group of practicing clinicians that collaborate to collect data, or clinicians and scientists that work together in a collaborative research to actually look at clinically meaningful questions in a naturalistic setting, paying attention to external validity, but also to have scientifically rigorous design. It's a long quote, but I think it's worth it. All right, so let's go very slowly. So practice research network is a collaboration that is aimed to foster a sense of equality. Share ownership. The data is not only owned by the researcher, it is shared by the researchers and the clinicians. And the mutual respect in the expertise of each of them. Promoting a diversity of scholarship, so different ways of understanding and investigating complex phenomena. It also capitalizes on complementarity, expertise, knowledge, experience of each stakeholder to provide opportunity for two-way learning in order to conduct studies that are both clinically helpful and scientific rigorous. So having people to sit together and thinking about what should we study and why should we study it and how should we study that in a way that will be actionable, right? And in a way that will be retainable. So it's not going to impose drastic change unless we want it to our practice. And hopefully, let's cross our finger, then once the studies is being done, it's still part of it is still going to be able to be retainable because it doesn't impose major burden to our practice. We don't have to change the way our practice in a way that is too burdensome. So one way of looking at that, for example, is studies that conduct in training. And so if you want to conduct a research and training, by the way, RCT is not necessarily in a control setting the best way to go because You need to have a large number of different type of training environment, different type of therapist, different type of orientation. So it's actually much better if you can go to a large practice-oriented, where you have large number of individual therapy, different type of therapeutic orientation, different type of supervisions to do. Right? So I'll be talking a little bit about some of the studies, just to kind of give you some example of studies that we have conducted when we have transformed our clinical training clinic at Penn State University into a practice research network, where the goal that we had in mind was to confound the three things, right? Confound research, clinical training, and training in general. So that the clinicians, you know, one of the really annoying things that we have to do when we're in grad school, so I have to do all my courses, then I have to do my supervisions, then I have to figure out a way to do research. Well, what about if actually, when you actually are doing your clinical clinical training in the environment, you at the same time doing your master and your dissertations? And how about if in the middle of your study I was going to ask you, that information that you actually have in your hands, are you doing that to help your clients better, or are you doing that for your masters? And if the answer is, I don't know, we're in. Right? Because we addressed the major problem. There is only 29 hours in a day. I've been looking for number 30, maybe in Jerusalem, but it's not in New York, despite what Jacques thinks. It's not in New York. So just a few examples of the type of thing. So for example, one of the students was interested about replicating what has emerged in a few studies about, is it possible that people actually have different patterns of change? And we replicated. So different instruments, different setting, training setting. And what we find is there were three patterns of change. People who actually will like four. One, people who start low and they don't change, as you might expect. Some people who actually start high and they kind of, or medium, and they, in terms of impairment, and they're decreasing slowly. And then there's a group of very high level of impairment and distress. And then after a few sessions, it splits. And there's people who remain high in distress and people who decrease sharply. And in this study, we were actually able to identify some of the predictors. High level of suicide, low level of social support, right? So that's really helpful clinically for the clinicians to actually know the students. There are some people who actually are staying really, really high, and some that will remain. Would then become a very interesting conceptual, clinical, and research challenge in our clinic, which is, if we replicate this, which we are trying to do now, then we gotta come up and sit together and say, how do we address this? And do a study that shows that the attempt to address this might actually be working. So you got a synergy that is taking place between research and clinicians. And you have absolutely zero doubt about the generalizations of those findings. Because those findings have come from one place and they are applied to the same place. You bypass the generalization issues. Another study into this environment by James Boswell, he actually used the multi, the instrument that Kevin McCarty and Jack Barber created, after each sessions of each of the therapists. I mean, that's a really nice thing to actually conduct your studies in clinical training, clinical clinic at a university, because all of your friends will actually sign up as a therapist, and they will ask all of their clients to fill out the measure. And so James has all of the therapists asking all of their clients at the end of each session, the therapist filled the multi, so what are the techniques that I have been using today? And the client felt a measure of how good that session was. And a very interesting finding, we find that there was no correlations between the technique that the therapist said that he or she used and their own theoretical orientation that they define, or the theoretical orientations of their supervisor. Interesting. We also find that the common factors were the one that was linked more to the perceptions of the client as this being helpful sessions. But we also find, an interesting issue of clients. We had multi-level issues, but I'll spare you the detail. But essentially what we find is, for clients that are being seen by therapists that typically focus a lot on common factor, very kind of Rogerian oriented. And for those clients who these therapists are applying more common factor than the rest of their clients. You got a really intense dose here of common factor. When these therapists use cognitive behavioral therapy, there's a decrease in terminal helplessness. So then it says things such as, well, integration, yeah, but you better know what you're doing. And the other thing, I keep saying that, don't know about you, right, but, and it's maybe because I'm an incompetent therapist. I am an incompetent therapist, right? But the fact is, I am so tired to hear cognitive behavioral therapy. It is so simple. You just go to ABCT, you take a workshop with Jonathan, or, Edna Foa, Marsha, and Ann, you're all set. Oh, jeez. Been doing that for 30 years, I still don't know what I'm doing, right? It's complicated. So cognitive behavioral therapy technique, to use that, oh, I think she's ready for the homework. You better know how to do that and what context to actually do this. Jonathan's workshop at ABCT, they're great, just go. We use the same instrument measure, the multi, and we actually also kind of and we find that, again, there was with Andrew McLevy master thesis, we find no relationship between the technique, the therapist orientation, and the supervisor orientation. But we also find that the humanistic intervention, as filled out and reported by the clinicians, the clinicians saying, I've been using a lot of those humanistic interventions, right? Used by therapists who define themselves as humanistic intervention. For those therapists, the frequency of humanistic interventions was significantly linked with outcome, but negatively so. And then you also had the use of psychodynamic interventions reported by the clinicians were negatively related to outcome when their supervisor were psychodynamic. Isn't that interesting? Right? Of course, one possibility here is rigidity. But right there, you have this data, and you're going to tell me that the supervisors would not be interested, and they'd be threatened by it, right? But that would be interesting. And the humanistic therapists would want this information. That's kind of interesting. But also the next finding, we actually explained a little bit the previous one, Boswell. We find that the cognitive intervention used by the cognitive therapists were only positively linked with outcome when the supervisors was a cognitive therapist. So complexity about this issue. In the studies, also, we were interested about another outcome-dependent variable that we had was the insight. How much insight did the clients make? And we find something really interesting. We find that exploring type insight-oriented, again using Kevin and Jacques instrument, we find that there was a significant relationship between the insight reported by the client, right, it's completely independent, and the type of technique reported by the therapist. But it was the reverse of what we were expecting. The exploring was negatively related to the insight achieved by the clients, and the directive interventions were positively related. Right? But what we also find is that this link, by the way, the directive interventions and insight, it only occur in the context of the therapist using a lot of common factors. Right? So it goes one step ahead. I mean, it's one step beyond, many of our RCT trials. It's perfectly complementary, but it's go one step beyond that. I have a few more examples that we did about can you improve psychodynamic therapy by homework that is consistent conceptually and clinically. And even though it's a very small sample that we use, the answer is yes, it looks like a psychodynamic therapist can actually use systematically, theoretically consistent homework So methods that is specific to CBT. And the alliance will be good, and they'll be able to do that frequency, and the effect size are actually really much in line with some of the studies conducted at Sheffield. So I'll give you a few other example of this one. So this practice research network that I talked about is within a clinical training. There's another practice research network that I've been involved. This time is with clinicians. So people working as private practitioners. So we have done several studies now, but then I'll focus on the second one that we conducted. And so we met for a year. And we, a few faculty members and clinicians, and we're asking questions. So what do we want to know? What is it that we want to know? And I vividly remember that there was a clinician. She said, you know what's really interested is I want to know at the end of every session, what did the client find helpful? That'd be very interesting to me. And then other clinicians said, I want to know if this actually is different from what I think it is. And then, I'd be interested to see if knowing what the client find helpful or not helpful, does that allow me to be more attuned to the needs of my clients? Right? That's pretty cool. I'm biased, but I think that's actually pretty cool. So we conducted this study, and we had those goals, and essentially the method was this. So with each of three groups, child, adolescent, adult, client was randomly assigned to experimental conditions. Right? I have been rejected. You have no idea about how many times I've been rejected by NIMH. I probably have the highest rejection rate.
How high?
It's higher than yours. I mean, it's like it's really you see my name and they say, no, well, let's not waste time, that's not. But regulated feedback is clinicians will not be able to do clinicians will not do what they sign that they will do. And you will not be able to do a randomized clinical trials in clinical practice. Completely wrong. So that we did experimental conditions. So essentially what we did is every new client that came in from our clinical practice, we didn't change our rates. Right? Every new client that came in, if we just, apropos, clinically, we would ask them if they want to participate into a study. And they were randomly assigned to an experimental group about receiving feedback in a control group. Right? So in the experimental, the feedback was given by the therapist and the clients in terms of helpfulness, and then in the control group, only the therapist, because we want to control for the issue of, well, it's just thinking about what might have been helpful today. If just that may actually allow me to be more helpful and attentive. All right, so it's just basically 13 experienced therapists. And we had 121 clients, so all our clients for a period of 18 months that came in. The vast majority said yes, just a few that we did not ask, and I think 0 who said, no, I don't want to participate with that. The meaning of the sessions, about 7, right? And then this basically was the study. At the end of every sessions, the people in the experimental group, both the clients and the therapists filled out a little card. Was there something that happened to do that was particularly helpful? If yes, rate it and then describe what it was. If there's something that was unhelpful or hindering, you turn the card and you fill this out. So my clients would fill this out, and then I would fill this out. Right? And then the only thing is that, and the control group, only the therapists were filling this card. Right? And the only thing that we decided to do is that we would read the card before the next session. Period. That's it. Nothing else than that. So one day I will actually write in the paper that inconsistent with what the NIMH say, the rich data. I mean, we collected 1,500 events that were significant, right? And then basically we scored them. We scored them very complex design instruments, and we find that for both the type of event that had the highest perceived impact score by both the clients and the therapists were statements or interventions or event reported that were coded as increasing the client's self-awareness. So you become a little bit more aware. I have a better sense of what my problem is. I'm helping the clients of having a clearer understanding of what the problem is. Right? And for the therapist, the same, except the therapist also reported helpful events that were coded as strengthening the therapeutic relationship. And then we ask ourselves, so during those events, positive and negative, helpful and unhelpful, what did they talk about? And it was the same thing for both the clients and the therapist, which was a therapeutic relationship. So when the therapist and the clients described things that was unhelpful or very helpful, it was about what was going on between the two of them. And then we did a study, I don't have time to talk about it, where we actually asked the therapist, what was your experience to participate in this study? What are some of the benefits that you got? What are some of the difficulties of actually doing that? And what are the general recommendations? One of which is, go beyond relevance, be helpful, and confound. Make sure that it actually is, my words, clinically syntonic, right? So that you actually, what's really cool about this is the information that you get is serving both clinical purpose and research purpose. We did more about this. I think in terms of time, I'm going to skip it. We use the multi for the next study, asking ourselves what was also the most perceived as being helpful. And could the clinician predict early in treatment the type of intervention that they would actually be using later into treatment? And again, the type of intervention that was perceived as the most helpful, both the clients and the therapists, were common factors. And yes, despite the literature on judgment, the clinicians were able to predict fairly accurately and fairly precisely the type of intervention that they would be conducted for the rest of the treatment. So now, I don't know how much time do I have left. I think I started at 9:30, 5 minutes. If I had a lot of time, right, I'd be talking to you, assuming you might be interested. I mean, how potentially should we actually do more of this? So there's a number of reasons that I think would be kind of, including asking therapists what they want to know, and working locally but collaborate globally. We need large N. That's one of the things that we actually need to do. And adopt a few. One of the things we need to do is, except if you're Dean and Jacques, you don't want to do that for the Dean. This is serious. Now of course, I am still upset of all this rejection rate, but I'm going to actually use in, I think, helpful purposes by narcissistic injury. I actually think that practice research network, practice-oriented network, should not be funded. They're not going to fund it anyway, so I mean, we might as well take a stand. So, you know what, we're not. Because here's the risk. That's worse than empirical imperialism. We have a risk of committing an empirical investigation, invasion. We have a risk of, we got 3 years, just 3 years to do as much research with clinicians. Let's go there, let's seduce them, let's get them in. And then in 3 years, when NIMH will decide, no, it's not important. Okay, bye, I hope it was good for you, right? But fine, we're going to see you again, right? We don't want to do that, and this is what's going to happen if this is going to become like the focus of the NIMH or any kind of federal agencies. It has to come from something that is more intrinsic. If not, it's not going to be retainable. We have to do that early into the treatment. We need to ask and tell. But very briefly, I mean, one way, if you are interested in doing this, Chris Moran and I put together a series in psychotherapy research. And we asked people like Bernard, for example, and other people who have done a lot of practice-oriented research. We asked, could you tell us a little bit why you did practice-oriented research? Could you actually tell us what are the obstacles and the solutions that you face? What are the benefits and what are the general recommendations? And this came because at some point, some people, now, I am defensive, but one of the reasons I'm defensive because, I applied to several POR at NIMH, the National Institute of Research, and I was always rejected. And then finally, they started funding them after I gave up. And then I got so many calls. Dr. Castonguay, they never know how to pronounce my name, but it's like, you know, I got funded. Do a PRN and I got to start in about a month. Could you help me out? And how do you do that? Right? And I got so tired, I said, you know what? I'm going to actually have some manuals. I'm going to call a number of people, including a good friend of mine, and say, could you write a paper to actually say in a clinical setting that you're working, whether it's private practice, whether it's a large insurance company, the work of Bernard, for example. So Bernard, what was your experience? Could you tell the people what they should do and what they should not do? So I think it was so helpful to actually, so different setting, different clinical purposes, what's the experience if you actually want to continue? And then with Jacques, actually, we actually made we took all of these papers from the series 11, and then we actually kind of aggregate across those 11 partnerships. What were some of the obstacles that we were facing? What were some of the fostering that we were strategies that we were using? You got to, as I mentioned, that's the other thing. That's the crucial part. The crucial part, right, is how do you have some collaborations, but in a way that you can actually generalize it, right? And there's no escape for this. We need large N, right? So it was great to work with 13 therapists, but that's not enough. There's questions you can't answer, and there's some expertise you're missing. So the other place we have to go with the PRN is to actually go and have large network of people who are doing the same thing in clinical training, for example. George Tosca developed in Canada a psychotherapy practice research network. And this visionary Ben Locke here, that's the third PRN I'm involved in. We now have 500 university counseling centers that are filling out the same measure that they decide that we should be using. And they, the center, decide how we should be doing it. And my students and I are benefiting from the fact that now every year we have 100,000 new patients that are getting the same instrument in the same way. I'm salivating every time I think about it. But in my dissertation I had 30 subjects. So my students are completely studying 200,000 subjects. We have a few significant results. Who cares about effect size? It's all the p-value. We should have a few guiding principles. We should conduct studies that address clinician questions. Let's remember Kazin wisdom. We can't ignore the knowledge to guide the type of research. We should also make research for and by that count. We should have journals to publish those papers. And we have to think beyond the bridge between science and practice and aim for the creations of new unified landscape of knowledge. Clinically syntonic, does not impose a drastic change of practice unless desired by the clinicians, that confound research and practice. We of course need to remind ourselves, right, that there are different types of knowledge, and they have both merit. The knowledge that comes from a pure academic perspective. I'm still continuing to do my control studies, right, completely coming from my own interest. Right? We have different knowledge. We have to recognize the merit of it. But we also, different road leads to Rome. But we can also think about another one, right, which we actually are combining our own knowledge together. Right? We also have to be thinking about the fact that if we don't do that, that's a clumsy indifference, right, considering our complexities. We also need to remind ourselves that in some of the most important pioneers of our field, like Carl Roger, they were clinicians and they were also researchers, right? So it's not only an issue of is it possible to build partnership or to integrate science and practice. It's one way to actually actualize it. There's never been a marriage between clinicians and researchers, right? But I think like a very exciting and profound attachment can actually be created. And we also know that sometimes the most unlikely relationships are the most beautiful, right? In the most beautiful song in French, Ne me quitte pas, arguably the most beautiful song ever. La braise said, quand vient le soir, pour qu'un ciel flamboie, de rouge et noir, ne c'est possible pas. When the night comes, for the sky to blaze, the red and the black has to get together. Now, of course, he was referring to Stendhal, and red and the black is, of course, is two different colors, but it's also people coming from two places. It's an impossible union, right? And it's made its way. Right? So I think the message would be really fantastic is si nous nous quittons pas, right? If we would actually work together, and actually if we actually work together, we're going to do some exciting research, and I think we are going to blaze the sky. Thank you.